Okay, in this review, I want to just go over some major concepts from the course all semester. So I want to remind you that this is assuming that you did your readings. So these are the things that you really need to go back through your notes and look at the readings again and really compare them to these concepts. There's going to be two new concepts that you really need to think about and prepare for the final exam, which are the totality of the circumstances and the balancing of interests. I'm now trying to get you to see this kind of three layers. So there's from your personal point of view, your identity, how you kind of fit within the structure. Then there's larger social groups and how they're kind of pit against each other, trying to vie for rights, for power, for influence, authority, etc. And then finally, we're going to look at it from the point of view of the courts. This last kind of piece, you'd then pick this up if you were taking my courts class in the spring. You'd then be focusing primarily at the courts, assuming that you kind of got all these pieces. If you're in both classes, now you're going to put these two ideas together. In theory, this should be a little bit easier for you now. So the concept of totality of the circumstances is a judicial doctrine. It comes out of the assumption that you have a working knowledge of math. And so I want to bridge that gap just in case you're like many students who are either afraid of math or you say you don't like it, to help you understand that you need to understand it regardless of whether you like it or whether you're afraid of it. So the idea here is pretty simple if you just think about it in terms of probability. And so this is pretty basic math, so nothing too complicated. But you want to think about what is the probability in this example of spinning green, right? So there's 4 total colors, and so there you've got a 1/4 chance or a 25% chance of landing on green when you spin the wheel. Now, pretty simple, right? Anybody who's ever thought about gambling or watched a poker game, right? This is the whole kind of point. The idea here, though, is that you have to be able to apply this kind of thinking, this logical reasoning, to all circumstances. So oftentimes with our kind of psychology, pop culture, people are always trying to blame individuals. They're trying to say, well, you're to fault, you have to fix this. That's not what the legal system does, and that's not what courts do. And so what they're doing is really trying to just figure out what are the probabilities of a situation. They're never, ever, ever trying to figure out the truth, no matter what anyone tells you. It's not possible given the legal system. The things that lawyers and judges do could never produce absolute truth. They're not scientists of physics. So you have to think about what can be done then. In any situation, you want to look at the constituted identities and think about what their role is. So you can't expect a police officer to behave like a priest, or a police officer to be a superhuman, or a police officer to be a pedestrian walking on the street. If someone's been accused of a crime and it fits like a racial bias or a sexuality bias, right, you can't expect them to behave differently than the stereotype or the labels that are being assigned to them within this structure. And that's how you have to start thinking about it. It's not how you want things to be, but it's how each of the players are probably, most likely, looking at the situation. Then you have to balance the interests. And you're balancing against two kind of concepts. One is individual liberty, and the other one is economic security. Many of you get confused. You hear there's a balance between liberty and security, and you think that's public safety. That is not what they're talking about. They're talking about economic security. How do you maintain the private property capitalist system against individual anarchy or individual rights? So anarchy is not when a bunch of people commit crime. Anarchy is when there's no stability or predictability in economic interests. And so that's what they're trying to regulate. They're willing to give specific individual liberties if it doesn't go against that structure. Okay, so that's the whole structure of the state, and this is how they're trying to make decisions, is on the totality of the circumstances. They're taking a little bit of the pieces from one side, taking a little pieces from the other side, and then taking the pieces from the legal system's history, and they're putting those together to see what's the probable outcome. Is it going to tend towards disbalance, right, disunity, or is it going to be a balance between individual liberty and economic security? So we want to think about this now in the Fourth Amendment. This is one of those major amendments as criminal justice students that you kind of come into contact with. So this language here comes from a case, Illinois versus Gates, which employs the totality of the circumstances test. So we want to think about it this way. If you just read the Fourth Amendment, it requires, right? Doesn't say maybe, doesn't say probably, doesn't say hopefully. It must. It requires. Any arrest. Arrest is a stop. So when a police officer stops you and you do not feel free to leave, that's an arrest. That must have a warrant, and that warrant must be based in probable cause, signed by a judge. So the police officer fills out a form, sends it to the judge reviews it and says, is there probable cause? Yes, you get your warrant, you can go stop the person, or no. They usually send that back and say, here are the reasons why you don't get it, and then the police officer tries to get what they need. Now, you're saying, wow, wait a second, this isn't what happens on TV. You're right, this isn't what happens on TV. And it doesn't really happen what happens in day-to-day life, right? This is provision, this is a law that was written in the 1700s. It has a history going back before that. It was at a time when a police officer was a political office, and you'd go to that office and you'd knock on the door and you'd say, I think my neighbor is doing such and such, and then the police officer would go to the other office and get the signature of the judge, and there'd be this whole long process, right? There's not even really horses at this time. Now you're in a very fast-paced society, and so we've come up with 13 exceptions to the warrant requirement in day-to-day life, and so that's what makes everything very complicated. But what you need to understand is the Fourth Amendment then is not the Fourth Amendment of the 1770s. Totally different Fourth Amendment now. Everything's changed. And so now this is how they make decisions, the courts. Whether or not there's a probable cause, remember the probability, this depends on the totality of the circumstances, meaning they have to include everything that's told to them by the arresting officers, which they're going to believe, they're going to trust the officers are telling the truth at the time of the arrest. So obviously this doesn't happen at the time of the arrest. This happens afterwards in the report. So you kind of got the defendant is going to say, well, this isn't what happened. And the police officer is going to say, well, this is what's going to happen. Again, they're never going to be able to prove the truth. They're just looking at the probability, looking at the total situation, which story is more probable. So it's still a flexible concept. It's always changing. It's not a firm definition. This is kind of what happens when you get away from the warrant. The warrant was built on probable cause only if a judge signed it. Now it's built on the idea of totality of the circumstances. So this is how the court and then really the individual police officer interprets the reasonableness standard. Remember, reasonable suspicion, the one you sometimes get confused with probable cause. This is now how they have to start thinking about it. If the police officer said that they have reasonable suspicion, they then wrote that into the report, they think that their reasonable suspicion is equal to the level of probable cause, the courts then look at the totality of the circumstances. They try to get as big of a picture as they possibly can. So now what you have to see is that this is, again, these rights are against each other. And so you want to go through each of the cases and see how do the rights apply. This is not something you really should copy and paste from the case. This is a way of you organizing your notes so that you can ace the final exam. So you can get an A on the final exam and not a C. And so the idea here is you need to go back through and think about how did the Fifth Amendment apply? Or how was it restricted? Or how was it limited? Same thing with the Fourth Amendment, 14th Amendment, and the 13th Amendment. For the 28th Amendment, this is going to go to like, how would you like this amendment process or the Constitution to change in this individual case? So if you think that, the system or the structure was fair in an individual case, but you'd like it to be tougher, that's where you'd put that in, is the 28th Amendment. If you think that it was unfair and you wanted to see a reform, then that's where you'd put that in. This is so to help you understand the difference between what you'd like it to be, what you want it to be, what you'd argue politically for it to be, and what the courts have said it is. So these are the steps that you want to go through as you're analyzing a case. We're mostly talking about procedural due process here. And so you want to think, what's the constituted identity? So in the Scott versus Sanford case, he's not a citizen, so he doesn't get the benefit of the civil rights. Okay, so he's not going to be treated the same way as somebody who's been granted citizenship. That's his constituted identity. It's not his moral identity. It's not his rightful identity. It's the Constitution identity for him. This goes the same for a lot of people, right? The Constitution is written for property holders. And so if you're not a property holder, then you're not going to get the benefit of the doubt. You're going to be suspect. You're going to be reasonably suspicious. And so you also want to think then, is this person or is this situation an agent of change, or are they being labeled, right? The person in Marbury versus Madison has got much more strength or agency, right, than the people in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, where they're being targeted. Same thing with the Miller case. And so you want to think about that's going to make a difference in the procedural due process. Things are going to be applied differently to different people based on their constituted identity of whether they're seen as an agent of change or whether they're seen as a label. And so then you want to think about, how is that structure working? Is the person able to advocate for themselves? Are they just trying to keep the status quo, or are they being targeted? And again, remember, property holders get the benefit of the doubt, whereas law enforcement gets the benefit of the doubt in high crime areas, which are anywhere there are poor people or people of color, basically, or in exigent circumstances. And those are 13 exceptions to the warrant requirement. So you have to think about, again, right? Law enforcement is not using exigent circumstances when they go into the Upper West Side, okay? When they go into Wall Street. That's not the mindset that they have. When they go into the housing, HSA, for example, they think they're going into a high crime area. That's what they're going to write in their report. And so the constituted identities are different in those two different places. So this is what you have to understand. Underrepresented people, whether it's people of color, whether it's gender and sexuality, whether it's based on poverty, your class or your working class, or based on cultural and ethnicity, right? Recent immigrants, targeted populations, they're not going to have as strong of individual rights. And so individual rights might not be the most productive or effective way of trying to organize. Political organizing might be a better idea, trying to get the laws passed, trying to resist and protest, things like that. This is not, again, the way it should be or shouldn't be. This is just, it's a system that's based on procedure. The procedure just has to be due. Okay, so it doesn't mean that it has to be fair. It means that it has to be consistent over these constituted identities. So now we want to think about this big picture kind of, the idea that we were told when we were growing up, or you might have been told in another class, right, is that we're supposed to be a country of laws, not men. It's a lovely idea. It's a principle that some people, very few people I think, but some people try to aspire to. But in reality, we're a government of humans, right? We're a government, and largely men still. CEOs are still largely run by men. So the country is kind of men. There's this balance, right? There's this tension between a legal system that's ideal and then how it's actually experienced by individuals. But nonetheless, it tends to benefit the powerful, and it tends to target certain populations. So what's the big difference? Well, I mean, it is a big difference, right? During the Middle Ages, say like the 1300s or the 1400s, the supreme rulers were elites, right? And they were rich and powerful, and subjects like us, citizens, we didn't have access to education. We just worked every day to stay alive. We didn't have time to think about rights. We didn't have time to think about, what we want to do next summer kind of things. And so you just didn't think about it. Every once in a while, there'd be something that would be just so awful that people would join together to try to just resolve that issue. Sounds kind of familiar, right? But by and large, right, there was no gap. There was no room in that gap to kind of maneuver, right? You were just kind of stuck in your position. Then at the turn of the revolution, merchants, traders, small business owners, these kind of middle-class people who were living in cities, mostly who were participating in the slave trade, they wanted to get their own power and influence. They wanted to take some power away from the elites, away from the aristocrats, away from the monarchy, and they wanted to share it amongst themselves. And so they called that self-government. They should be allowed to organize themselves. Again, these are mostly men, right? And they're mostly capitalists. And so what they looked to justify why they should be allowed to take power away from the aristocrats was what they called nature's God, if you look carefully in the Declaration of Independence. And so these are the kind of strategies that they used in order to try to take the supreme rule of law away from the king, away from the aristocracy, and distribute it amongst themselves. Now, the dilemma is that under the God of nature, it was self-evident that some were meant to be slaves and others to be masters. At that time, this is how they thought. They thought if you were capable of taking power, if you were capable of self-government, if you were capable of drawing up a constitution, then you were meant to be a master. That was nature's way of rewarding you. And that if you weren't capable of doing that, if you were subject to be a slave, then you were destined to be a slave. But upon reflection, as they were kind of going through their governmental process and certain contradictions were coming out, people were starting to question this idea. They were saying, well, that's justice without a remedy, right? If nature is just the only thing that matters, then why even have a government? Why even have these bodies where we can all, discuss and have the First Amendment and all these things that we think about? And so they started thinking about two concepts. One is we're born equally. So even if you are rich or poor, right, you could still die at birth, right? Many people were dying at birth at this time, and you're all going to die, right? So no matter how much money you have, you're still going to die. And so they thought, we want to try to have a government system that promises that between birth and death, right, people have an equal opportunity, an equal shot to participate. But acknowledging or understanding, pointing out that that's the contradiction. It's not nature that makes us unequal. It's us. We make each other unequal in our social arrangements, what we call government. And so what was their remedy for this? In their mind, the best thing to do is have a Congress, elect people, have them come to this place called Congress, and pass laws to try to divide things evenly. That was their solution. You can decide for yourself whether you think that's a good solution today. But that's where they thought sovereign power should reside with the Congress and legislature. It's why it's Article 1 of the Constitution. They're the ones who are supposed to be solving these problems. Now, that brings me to some comments about misunderstandings of the Bill of Rights. Right? The biggest point of the Bill of Rights is that it was really to try to fix the problem of slavery. And so if you see on the right here, the southern states, which is this kind of purple-blue color. Sorry, I'm colorblind, so I'm not 100% sure what that is. But they're arguing for the Bill of Rights. They need to have a Bill of Rights because they want to protect themselves against the North. They're pretty sure that the North is going to try to take away their rights, take away their self-government, and tell them they can't own slaves, which would suddenly turn them all very poor, which is what ends up happening after the Civil War. Now, there's also all these territories that the United States is organizing to take away, to kick out Native American populations, as well as the French and as well as Spanish and Mexicans, and take that land and redistribute it, give it to more white males. And so there's this kind of compromise that's going on, and that's what produces the Bill of Rights. And so those rights aren't really for individuals, those are for states. And so the collective people within the state of Virginia, they want the First Amendment to argue and say that the federal government can't take these things away. That's kind of the same idea for all of the amendments. However, over time, obviously, as politics has changed, as the demographics have changed, as the struggles have changed, that's changed the way we think about rights. And so now we think about it much more in the individual sense. Individuals argue that they have rights, and that's how you get this framework of economic security versus individual liberty that kind of continues today. So the last things to keep in mind now, as you kind of understand the Constitution is built around the economic structure, it's not built around individuals. So how organizations mobilize bias within groups against outsiders is through the means, through the habits, the norms, the rules of the group. So Congress people organize against lobbyists. Lobbyists organize against other lobbyists. Democrats organize against Republicans. Landlords organize against tenants. Tenants organize against landlords. So these groups all kind of work against each other and develop their own rules, and they identify their processes as being better than the other side. That's what mobilized bias is. This is what largely comes out of the behavioral theory of organizations. This is what you have to really, really understand as the main point. The rest of that reading will help you understand why. Why do we fall for these things? What's wrong with our brains? How come we can't see the bigger picture? We can't look at the goal or the ideal. And again, it's based on, well, what are your habits, right? That's what helps you see the big picture. So if your habits are to mobilize bias of your in-group against the out-group, then that's the system you're going to get. And that's our party system. That is our political system. Now, you have to think about courts, Congress, agencies, states, cities, local governments, municipalities, the MTA, Department of Health, right? Police officers, corrections officers. They all have their own organizations. They're not one big organization. They're not all working together. They're largely working against each other. So in the news you saw there was a state, Minnesota, that was arguing that they should switch money from policing to public health. Think about that for a second. Right? So policing is against public health, and that's the system we have. That's exactly a good, argument for what this theory is saying. One group is organized against the other. They're biased, and so they're disagreeing with each other. Wouldn't it be great if we could live in a society where we were for public health and for policing, right? Not against and against and against. But again, that's not the political system we live in. So rights are a way of talking. Rights are a way of arguing. Rights are a way of organizing politics. They're not a guarantee. You don't just get them. They're not automatic. And they have to be interpreted. So they're not even really clear, right? People say, I have the right to my body. Nobody really knows what that means. They only know what it means within their own individual protest. They're saying, I have the right to do this. And then you've got somebody on the other side saying, no, I have the right to do this. So it's not anything more than just a way of talking. It's important. It helps people think about what's important to them and what they think should be political and how they make change. But it's not going to change things by itself. So society largely influences what you think you know, and how you know it. And it does this through media, right? It does this through family, through religion, through schooling, right? Through your social groups. And so there's always more information to know, and there's always more information you get from other social groups. Stereotypes matter. I know we like to think that, sticks and stones may break your bones. They are tremendously important. In fact, in criminal justice, there's a theory that comes out of the University of Chicago called labeling theory. That shows you how much stereotypes matter. They make a huge difference in the way that we think about what organizing means. What does protesting mean? And these are why words matter. Words matter because they lead to this kind of consciousness or this action and this issue awareness. And this is how people generally think about politics and rights. And so this has an influence all the way through the system. So at best, constitutional lawyers in the Supreme Court are trying as hard as they can to include all these diverse perspectives or the totality of circumstances. But please keep in mind, they are educated within a biased system, an organized, mobilized bias of seeing the law one way, which is called liberal legalism and the republic. They say, this is the situation in which you are supposed to elect your official. That official will make change. I saw a post on Instagram the other day. The person was upset that New York didn't pass the voting, certain voting provisions in the last election. Okay, and you're allowed to be upset, but they're saying they're going to overturn that. They're going to argue to the politicians that they have to overturn that. But think about that for a second. That on the one hand, they're saying that they're supporting democracy and that they think the people should get to decide. The people decided. Now they're saying, no, I don't like the decision, and so I'm going to undermine it. And I'm not just picking on that example. This seems to be the climate we're in, where we say, we're going to vote for something, and then people vote for it, and they say, no, it was rigged. The whole thing was wrong. Well, that's the system we live in. That's what liberal legalism as the republic is. So if you're saying it's corrupt, if you're saying it's rigged, then you shouldn't participate in it, and you certainly shouldn't benefit from it. And so we'd have to go back to the drawing board and say, how are we going to build the society? And try to keep in mind, this whole system is built on the customs of English settlers from the 1600s, and this is what constitutions are. So I'm all for and favor. Let's rethink and modernize our political legal system. It's not necessarily a good idea to just keep using the same thing over and over again, especially if it doesn't seem to make anybody happy. And so there used to be that saying, don't break something, or don't fix something that's not broke, or this is, all the other systems are worse than this, so let's have this system. I mean, these are also really old ways of thinking and not very useful. If everyone is unhappy, then we really should be looking at a different way of thinking about legality, and a different way we should be thinking about social change. But until that day, the system that you're in right now really doesn't promote change. It's mostly trying to keep the status quo. And so when you see people resisting, this is really what the 14th Amendment is all about. It's about increasing political participation, making more people citizens, getting them to be involved, and so that the system doesn't break, it changes, it adapts to the culture and the people around it. And democracy then is when norms and roles, or culture, represent all of those who participate, whether they're protesting, they're organizing, they're voting, they're running for office, they have a small business, right? They're landlords, whatever. When everybody's involved in that political process, that's what democracy is. So democracy and republic aren't the same thing. And I'm not talking about Democrats and Republicans, right? Democrats and Republicans are both a part of the republic. The republic is part of the Constitution, and the Constitution says that you have to vote for people. Democracy, on the other hand, is when everybody participates in the process. And it's really what started the whole thing, and people tend to lose sight of that. You need to keep this big picture in mind when you think about those three levels. There's how do you fit within the system? How do social groups fit in the system, including the one that you might belong to or that you would prefer to work with? And then how does the larger system view you, and how does it view change? Now, just to close, I want to give you the details of the exam. So over to the right, I just want to remind you that the final exam is 15% of your final grade. The final draft of your paper is 25% of your grade. And then this very brief but important civic engagement final reflection assignment is 10% of your final grade. These are the three things that you have left to work on before you're done. The exam will open on December 10th and it will close on December 14th. No exceptions. It must close on 14th so I can get the grades done in time and send them in. Now, part 1 will be reading comprehension on multiple choice. So this is about those major readings that you've been supposed to be doing all semester. Part 2 will be long answer, and this will be all about what I just talked about. Balancing rights, balancing rights, balancing rights. And I'll be saying, do you understand probability and the totality of the circumstances? Or are you still looking to make law be an absolute dictator that tells everybody what to do and always works all the other time, or else there's consequences? I'm trying to get you out of that way of thinking. I understand why you have it, but it's not realistic. It's not how the law actually works, and it's certainly not how constitutional law works. And then finally, the short answer will be building on the civic learning and democratic engagement work that you've been doing all semester, and seeing if you're able to apply that knowledge, are able to see it and then apply it, and really give me a good understanding that you were developing social responsibility. So this is really big picture. It's cumulative. It'll be looking at everything that you've been learning and putting all the pieces together. I highly recommend using the rights table. Go back through your notes, get them really nice and organized, and be sure to talk about the readings in the final exam. Very important that you talk about the readings, and to talk about how your opinion or how your thinking has changed throughout the course of the semester. That's really good advice for all of your classes. But it's particularly good if you want to get an A in this class. I think you're all doing a great job of just trying to keep going as we're still trying to manage our way out of this pandemic. And I hope that everyone gets some time to study, and that you do the best you can.